Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 4 of our course on social problems. So the first few weeks of this course, we've really dedicated a lot of time to kind of establishing and building a sociological foundation for how we're going to study, try and better understand, and generate potential solutions to social problems for the remainder of the semester. So just a quick recap of what we've covered so far and kind of the significance or why we took so much time really developing our sociological foundation before we specifically start addressing certain social problems. The first week, we talked about bias and the importance of being able to do some deep reflexive work to understand where our biases come from and what biases we may have. And again, the purpose of that is not to make anyone feel like they're a bad person or to intentionally make you discomforted. But as I've said a lot in this course, and I'll continue to say, it's important that we lean into those feelings of discomfort when we experience them, questioning why we think the way we do, if we put more value or have preferences towards certain groups of people versus others. It's very, very unlikely that anyone is born innately with bias. Bias is something that we learn through socialization, through our exposure to certain people or lack of exposure to different types of people, the exposure we have to media, the stories that are being portrayed about people, often furthering ideas behind stereotypes of different cultures and communities. So it's important that we take some time to establish this understanding of bias and how, when groups of people have shared or similar biases, how those contribute to social problems. So the second week, we defined what social problems were from a sociological perspective. We took a much closer look at what the social structures in society are and how those contribute and shape the seemingly individualistic choices and behaviors we're able to make. And again, it's important to understand the structural basis of social problems because we live in a society that really tends to blame individuals for their problems rather than taking a critical look at the systems or the structures in society. And of course, this tool, the sociological imagination, that we've also spent some time reflecting on, is this ability in sociology for us as humans to begin to understand this relationship between structures and individuals in society. So again, we've said before in this class, instead of blaming individuals, we're going to be blaming the systems or being critical of the systems, instead of just saying a poor person is poor because they are lazy, because they choose not to find a job, in supporting this idea that anyone can, quote unquote, pull themselves up by the bootstraps and live the American dream if you just work hard enough. Sociology, again, is going to be very, very critical of statements like that because we know sometimes individual work ethic and a desire to succeed are not enough when there are structural barriers or obstacles in the way, preventing people from pulling themselves up out of poverty or improving their social class position in society. Having that upward social mobility isn't always attainable, and it's definitely not equally attainable to all people. As we'll talk about this week, there's gender and race and age and ability and all of these different intersections of social identity that affect individuals' ability to improve their socioeconomic status and improve their social class in that regard. And then, of course, last week we took a closer look at the concepts of privilege and oppression, which again are important for us to understand because when we look at the structural level and we start to see how people are structurally disadvantaged in our society, how marginalized communities do not have access to the same opportunities as privileged communities in our society, we start to see how these social problems become really deeply embedded in the fabric of society, which is what makes them difficult to solve. But I don't want to sound like a complete pessimist because there are things we can do as a society to make changes both at the individual level and at the larger structural institutional level to fight a number of these social problems. And so as much as it's important for us to develop an understanding of why these social problems exist, starting this week and moving forward in this class, every week I want us all to be constantly thinking, what can we do to solve these problems? What are some behaviors or actions that we can take at the individual level, things that we can do in our own communities and our own lived experiences to address some of these social problems. And then also thinking at a grander level too. It's okay to think at a bigger level. What are some bigger policy changes that we would like to see? What are some laws that could be passed that could help address and fix some of these social problems in our society? So always be thinking, both individually and then larger at that institutional level, what are some solutions that we could put into place using the science of sociology to help us make informed choices and decisions to improve the quality of life for everyone in our society, right? So this week, we're going to start off by looking at our first social problem in a more detailed context, and we're going to look at the social problem of poverty. And of course, this is an increasingly important topic in our current society. This past year with the pandemic has been really catastrophic for a lot of families, not just because of the health issues, but because of the way that income inequality in our society has really disproportionately affected people of lower socioeconomic status, definitely people living in poverty, homeless, the unemployed. COVID has had a much more significantly negative impact on those marginalized communities than, for example, people that were able to maintain their jobs, people that were able to maintain their health insurance, people that were able to keep a roof over their head, So be thinking about, as we're covering this content this week, think about how this pandemic has disproportionately affected people of lower socioeconomic status and made it even more difficult for people that were struggling financially to make any type of advancements, right? How are you able to pull yourself up out of poverty if you lost your job due to this pandemic? That's a great example of how, poverty is, again, a social problem versus an individualistic problem. People couldn't control losing their jobs from this pandemic. And it wasn't as easy just to say, oh, well, if you lost your job, you can go out and find another one. Our economy is struggling. Businesses are struggling to stay open, to provide jobs to people. And our unemployment at the state and federal level is struggling to provide resources to people. There are millions of people that had to file for unemployment, and for some of them it took weeks. For others, it took months to even get their first unemployment benefits. So think about that. How are people supposed to survive? There was millions of people that were living without any income for periods of time and continue to struggle in our society because we're still very much dealing with this social problem. And now even thinking about just this last week, it was a hard week for Texans. Virtually statewide, we had, people going days without power, with lack of water, with lack of food. And then again, think about how that disproportionately would be affecting people that were lower socioeconomic status. What happens if you're a homeless person this past week? Where did you go to stay warm, to survive? If you're lucky, you lived in a city that provided some type of shelter, a community shelter. But then again, we're in a pandemic, so you're putting yourself at increased risk of being surrounded by large groups of people that are all seeking shelter. What did you do if you couldn't afford to go rent a hotel room or somewhere with electricity and running water to stay warm and to support yourself? So always be thinking about applying the content and the concepts that we're discussing in this class to what's actually happening in our world right now, in our own community, both locally, at the state level, even at the national level, and at a global level as well. All right. So with that in mind, let me reduce my screen here and go ahead and pull up the content for this week. So if we go into the course content folder on Blackboard and open up our week 4 content folder, you will see the exercise and content for you to view this week. So of course I have the to-do list up here. First thing on the to-do list this week is to complete an exercise. It's called SPENT. Some of you may have experienced this before. If you've taken my Intro to Sociology class, I incorporate this into that class as well. And basically what SPENT is it is an online simulation. I don't like to call it a game. Some people call it that, but I think a simulation is a better term for that. That provides insight as to what it's like to live at or near the poverty line and to try to avoid homelessness. And so I think this is a good activity to begin with this week, because if you've never had to worry about where your next meal is going to come from, or worry about whether or not you're going to be able to keep the lights on or keep a roof over your head, this is a simulation that can give you a small glimpse of what it's like to have to make some of these very difficult decisions. And I do provide a sensitive content disclosure for this exercise because This can be triggering if you're someone who has ever lived, in a low socioeconomic status conditions or household. I don't want this to be traumatizing or triggering to anyone who maybe has experienced homelessness or the struggle of living near the poverty line or below the poverty line firsthand. So if you feel like this could be a triggering exercise, feel free to skip over this. You definitely don't need to complete that. The next thing I have for you to view is just a brief testimony provided by an individual named Ms. Hutchinson to Congress. She proposed changes to the poverty line, which we'll talk a lot about this week, what the poverty line is and how it's calculated. And this testimony is just a very powerful example of this idea that we can't blame individuals who are living in poverty. The testimony that Ms. Hutchinson provides is it's heartbreaking. It's difficult to hear, but she's an example of an individual, like millions of individuals in the United States, who is working so incredibly hard to provide for herself and for her family. And even though she is doing everything she possibly can in her own individual power, she is still struggling just to make it by, to provide basic necessities for her and her loved ones. So I think it's important to develop some sympathy or some compassion, at least, for individuals who are living through this, if you've never personally had to experience it yourself. This is just a chapter from an online textbook that sociologically explains the problem of poverty in the United States. It also provides some information about poverty at a global level, but we're largely just going to be focusing on United States poverty this week. So very informative read. And then this is just another sociological blog, a short reading that explains how expensive poverty is, how difficult it is to live at or near the poverty line. This is a video that unpacks the eviction crisis in the United States. A sociologist a few years ago wrote a really popular book called Evicted that kind of explains how social problem of poverty affects eviction rates in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the United States. And this is just a brief little video that kind of unpacks that research and the problem that it addresses. And then lastly, you have 4 brief lecture videos this week in which I kind of unpack a lot of terms from the text and provide sociological explanations for the social problem of poverty, especially this last video here where I apply the big 3 sociological theories on poverty. Very important video to understand how the 3 different sociological perspectives, functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, all kind of explain the existence of poverty in a sociological context. All right, so I hope you find the content for this week to be informative. I've been really enjoying reading your discussion post in previous weeks. So continue to apply your sociological imaginations and your thinking, and to think like sociologists in those discussion posts. And of course, remember to cover the 5 C's in both your EOP and your comments to earn full credit. All right. If you have any questions or concerns as you're working through the content for this week, always feel free to shoot me an email or visit me during my WebEx office hours. All right. Take care, everyone. Stay well.